In a market where unpredictability has become predictably common, the whole concept of accurate earnings guidance from the lines fell overboard several quarterly reports ago. Forecasts are couched in ever more provisional language, and volatility and black swans continue to demand near constant expectation management amid yo-yoing sentiment. While US retailers are balking at the return of $10,000 container shipping rates for a 40-foot box from Shanghai to New York a few weeks back, the lines were more concerned about the looming long winter to follow the unexpectedly early peak season. But port congestion is easing. There's been a rates correction, so we're heading back to some semblance of balance in the market, right? Well, before you unbuckle your seatbelt and prepare to disembark the box rollercoaster, you may want to listen to this week's podcast, because any feelings of relief, I'm afraid, may be short-lived, as more and more economies get embroiled in a trade war and tariffs become a hot-button issue in the upcoming US election. Oh, and then there's the Red Sea to consider, and looming union contract negotiations in the US, Panama Canal, potentially more reshuffling in the alliance. The list goes on. So what happens next? Well, we will get to that, but to understand the dynamics shaping the future, we need to first take a quick look at how we got here. Here's Sanny Manders, president of Flexport, to help us get up to speed.
And let's play the clock a little bit back, right? When we were looking at this market, let's say 9 months ago, the outlook was very clear. There would be way too much capacity for the demand, right? At some point, I saw analysis where we basically needed to absorb capacity till 2030 to get to a balanced market again. That's how much new build is coming to the market and still is coming to the market. I think it has peaked a little bit in terms of, let's say, new deliveries. We're still seeing for the remainder of this year and next year, a lot of new build coming to the market. Now, obviously, the big thing that changed is the Suez Canal, right? And the Suez Canal has shifted the supply-demand balance dramatically because the impact is really big. And I'm not talking about single digit, it's double digit impact in terms of capacity absorption, which made all of a sudden this gap between supply and demand, which was around 20%, made it close to zero. Now, then playing the clock a little forward, when we were all at TPM, which is the big maritime conference in Los Angeles in March, I think 100 out of 100 shipping analysts were forecasting that this fundamental market demands just steady, no big changes overall, more deliveries coming. So the fundamentals were still the same, and everyone predicted that the prices would remain low for the remainder of the year. Well, we all know now that the opposite has happened. So 100 out of 100 analysts were wrong, including myself. And I think that's a combination of a couple of things. Right? Peak season came early, and peak season came early because there's anxiety in the market, right? What if I can't have my goods on time for the back to school season or for, the latter part of the year, which the whole economy is running on. So you saw more pre-ordering. We could see that in our order management system also, that our customers were ordering more than normal and pulling their orders forward. And I think that anxiety was all driven by, the uncertainties that you were just mentioning. And those uncertainties are obviously the Red Sea, right? The Red Sea remains an uncertainty, and it might remain an uncertainty for the coming 5 years. We just don't know. The labor side, specifically the East Coast labor union strike, that might or might not happen. But we do see a lot of customers that are actually making their supply chains more resilient by moving things to the West Coast, right? By ordering early to make sure that they're not subject to that strike. We always have the impact of drought or any other natural disasters. I think, with climate change accelerating, I believe the last 2 days were record temperatures on the world, both yesterday and the day before. There are more natural disasters. There might be a big typhoon season right now in Asia starting. All these things bring uncertainty. Then I think the big one obviously is elections and any other geopolitical risk. And I do think that the North American elections are a big factor that a lot of importers are taking into account, specifically when are additional duties going to be implemented. We already saw a lot of additional duties being implemented. Right now in the summer, for instance, on electric cars, the European Union did something similar. And importers try to beat that, try to basically get their products onshore before the duties are applying. But there's obviously more geopolitical tension on the horizon. And then last but not least, it's always the consumer confidence, which obviously is related to a lot of these other factors like the political environment.
We will get on to that tricky political environment in just a moment. But that pre-ordering and front-loading that Sani mentioned, that's worth exploring here briefly because it is key to what happens next. On the demand side, you had this bubble created by the behaviour of shippers who started to bring forward orders because they were concerned about the longer transit times. They then get told there's congestion, so they do it again and again. And then, of course, there was the more optimistic outlook for growth in the economies that are consuming all these goods. So predominantly in the US, if you're thinking about the Transpac trade, and a bit on the Asia-Europe as well. All of this combined to create a perfect storm which inflated a bubble. And we all know what happens to bubbles. Here's Chantal McRoberts, Director of Drury's Supply Chain Advisory Team.
Now, looking ahead, does that bubble sort of last for the next 6 months or does it last for, the next year? The key to all of that is the releasing of the latent capacity via the opening of the Suez and then the easing of this port congestion by improved port productivity. That's not compounded by landside congestion. So when that happens, you'll start to see the rates come down. Layer that again, that the capacity that's been caught up that was going to be massively surplus. I mean, I think the fleet is over 30 million TEU now. There isn't 30 million TEU of cargo moving. That's going to come back into play and then we're going to see it impact the rates. So you have both of these sort of sides playing off each other. I think when you look at what the economists are saying, what we can see is that there's other impacts than that. You have geopolitical pressures, but the world economy recently has been quite resilient to that. So that hasn't stopped shipping rates going up, whether it's gone down or whether there's been sort of geopolitical instability. So I think there are reasons to be worried if you're a carrier, but reasons to be optimistic if you're a shipper. And I'm not sure the world economy is, although it's an underlying driver of growth for the industry, it's not necessarily the main driver of what's going to happen in the next sort of 18 months, shall we say. But I'm not an economist.
Chantal is not an economist, but there are plenty of them out there who are getting a little bit concerned right now. Investors are underestimating the risk that surging shipping costs will push up inflation and slow the pace of interest rate cuts by the European Central Bank and the Bank of England and everyone else, they argue. So, should we be worried?
Rising freight costs will certainly have an impact on inflation overall.
That's the ever-insightful Huaju Tan you just heard there. He's the co-founder of Lynalytica.
And depending on the value of the commodity being shipped and the trade lane that the goods are shipped in, the recent rise in container freight rates could add anything from 1% up to 5 to 6% to the total cost of goods sold. So that is clearly a cause for concern. But it is also important not to overplay the impact of freight rates on inflation globally because there are a few mitigating factors at play here. So firstly, a large proportion of containerized cargo are shipped under contract, and the contract rates are significantly lower than the spot rates that tend to dominate the news headlines. So even though a large number of contract shipments have also seen rate increases this year, with surcharges also being applied to these contract shipments, the contract rates are still significantly lower than the headline spot rates. So the impact on cost inflation, especially for the largest shippers, will not be as high as the headlines would suggest. Now, a second point is that we have also seen a correction in freight rates, especially in the last 2 weeks. If you look at the SCFI, they have started to fall from their recent peaks. And the actual freight rates on some of these routes out of China are down 20 to 30% from their recent highs. What we have at the moment is market forces working as they should, because carriers are adding capacity to the routes that are most profitable or where freight rates are the highest. So we have seen, for example, new capacity being added in the China to US West Coast and Mexico trade. And overall capacity between Asia and the US West Coast is up 15% year over year. And if you look at Asia to Latin America, that's up even more by 33% year over year. So the influx of new capacity has been instrumental in tilting the supply-demand balance back to the shipper's favor. So while the freight rates are still elevated at the moment, they are not at critical levels. And I think we should allow market forces to function as required, because ultimately prices will be set by demand and supply.
So what happens next? That's the question. Does Kamala have a chance of staving off a Trump 2.0 tariff war? Does a ceasefire emerge in Gaza? And does that actually call a halt to the Houthis' campaign? What about carbon taxes? And what about the fleet supply? What about the shifting pockets of congestion? What about the things we haven't even thought about yet?
So what's happened next, right? If you're looking at it right now, a week or two ago, you saw a moment that the prices started to go down again. So we're now getting more into a situation where, the peak season is over, so demand is reducing and supply keeps on increasing because more vessels are being launched. So as a result, you're going to that fundamental scenario that everyone was talking about in March, where there's more supply than demand, which should lower the rates, right? Now, this will go slowly because there's still also a lot of congestion in ports. There's equipment shortages in a lot of different places. Short term, if I look, let's say 2 to 4 weeks out, there's still a lot of space constraints on vessels as well. But we're looking longer term, and I'm talking here about like late August, September, we do see the market easing. And if the market is easing, then the prices should come down. Now, I think the overall thing is here, and you're calling it a whiplash. I think we need to be prepared for volatility, right? If the Red Sea situation would resolve, there's not much volatility because there's so much overcapacity at that moment in time that the prices will be low, right? Because it might actually be, from a carrier perspective, very unsustainable because you're getting under cost there. But the prices for shippers will be low. I don't expect the Red Sea to resolve anytime soon. So you're always going to be in that situation where demand and supply are pretty close to each other. So then any disruption will lead to a volatility in prices and space constraints. So this is what shippers need to prepare for. It might be a volatile market out there for the next couple of years.
So I think it depends which side of the fence you're sitting on. If you're a carrier, you're going to be looking at this change in the geopolitical landscape, particularly in the US, and looking out for the tariffs, because that's really going to impact the flow of cargo, whether we go down the route of protectionism or not, whether there is a increase in tensions between the US and China. That will also cause concern. And we still have the ongoing issues with the Ukraine as well. So that seems to have been put to the wayside, but that does impact as well, that geopolitical instability. So if I was a carrier, I would be concerned about that because flows of my business will change. I've ordered ships to flow in between those two lanes, in particular China and the US. And then what do I do with my assets? If I'm a shipper, I'm thinking, right, well, if we see port productivity improve, whether that's because the Suez opens or they manage to do that in isolation, then that will free up sort of the stickiness that's causing this at the moment. So that's a good thing for me. I will also look out if I see fewer blank sailings, because that's another sign that capacity will be coming back into the market. The carriers have been very good at blanking sailings and masking that as because of the Suez. They've been doing it to manage some of the capacity as well, I'm sure, which is something we thought they would have done last year, but they didn't manage to do it. So the world has given them the golden goose from which to take that from. So I think those are the kind of things that you'd be watching. You can't watch for black swan events. We know they happen. We know they have massive disruptive impacts on the supply chain. But I think by now, most shippers have contingency plans in place. So they can handle and respond to that better. We saw that through the Suez, but it created a demand surge. I would also be looking at sustainability, CO2 regulations. Once again, that's sort of the looming cost that's been forgotten, particularly right now. You have ETS that's going to be going up next year. You know, the discussions about how to set an ETS value that was quite a big concern at the end of last year. Obviously, it got swallowed up and forgotten about. I think it's going to come back again, particularly for shippers who are suddenly going to have a very big bill with a lack of visibility on how that's being calculated. So that's another side to this. And obviously, if we go down the route of global carbon taxes as well, that's going to impact the industry. I still think there's quite a lot of destabilizing things that will happen that we know are coming that people will need to start to plan around. But the positive or negative depends on which side of the fence you are, because for the carriers who are also ordering ships right now, it is tenuous. And for the shippers, if they've been managing to get their contracts honoured, then okay. If they're in the situation where they've had to pay PSS, hopefully the PSS will go. If they've had to pay one of the various Red Sea surcharges, hopefully they've de-risked contracts and said, you know, when that opens, this goes. So these are all the things that are going to make perhaps the next bid season even more interesting than last year. So there's a lot to look out for. And unfortunately, if you're sat, you know, sort of either side, procurement team or a carrier sales team, you need to be tracking all of those things.
So we know about the big variables, the swing factors. Any resolution in the Middle East situation is going to see ships going back through the Suez Canal again, and that excess supply that has been absorbed by the current diversions around the Cape, that's going to come back quickly once the Red Sea situation is resolved. And the impact of that would be an immediate oversupply situation developing very quickly in the region. And we're not talking about a small one. We're talking about 8 to 10% here. And when you have excess supply to that scale, it will certainly bring the market down. The question, of course, is how quickly we get to this tipping point, and that is an unknown factor. Because even if we do have a ceasefire in Gaza, that doesn't necessarily translate into the Houthis' attacks against shipping immediately ending. But it's not just the big variables like the Red Sea that we need to be thinking about, is it?
There's plenty of other risks here, and it's very difficult to predict when the next disruption is going to come. I mentioned earlier the two key tipping points, but apart from that, the International Longshoremen's Association, or the ILA contract negotiations in the US East Coast, are right now in everybody's radar, and the rhetoric has certainly been stepped up in recent weeks. And with the US presidential elections shaping up into a very tight race, this could have the potential to flare up into a major flashpoint, because the US East Coast accounts for almost 50% of all US container imports right now. And if the East Coast gateway ports are shut, there is just no way that the West Coast ports would be able to accommodate all of these volumes coming into the US. So that's certainly a major risk factor at this stage. And time is running short because the ILA contract would expire at the end of September. And that is just 9 weeks from where we are right now, and that runway is getting very short. And on a related note as well, we are hearing increasing talk around a Trump tariff, and how this is going to pan out is certainly going to be quite interesting, because there is a potential to significantly disrupt trade flows, because we will surely see a massive ramp up in front loading once the tariffs are announced, and this will be followed by a major slump in volumes as trade flows adjust to the new tariff regime. Now, there is certainly a major risk factor there, but it is really premature to act on this right now, given that nothing is essentially clear at the moment. I haven't seen any significant evidence to suggest that we have front loading happening for this reason right now. There is certainly some volumes that have been pulled forward, but that is due more to concerns over freight rate increases and avoiding the potential ILA disruptions. But even that has not been material enough to bring peak season volumes sufficiently forward to a point that we see demand suddenly falling off in the middle of the traditional peak season. Now, as far as the Panama Canal situation is concerned, we have seen significant improvements since May, with post-Panamax transit slots already increased along with the draft limitations for ships. And as far as container ship traffic is concerned, we are pretty much back to normal right now. So at this point, the Panama Canal is not an immediate concern until the next drought hits Panama again. But until then, there's really not much that the market can do, as there is no real alternatives for them at the moment. Now, I just want to end with one additional risk factor that will come into play very shortly, and that will be coming from the alliance reshuffling involving the end of the 2M and the alliance as it stands. And that will happen fairly shortly. It will start from January next year with the formation of the Gemini cooperation between Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk. In the best case scenario, the transition could be smooth and ships get phased in and out with little disruptions. And in that scenario, by the time we get to February and March, the new networks will be in place and the market wakes up to the new carrier landscape. But unfortunately, I do see a lot of room for disruptions both during the transition period, but also beyond, because essentially 2/3 of the global East-West network will change, as it is not just about Hapag-Lloyd and Maersk, but also MSC and the remaining members of the alliance will also be involved. So I would certainly expect some market action happening around this, because it's not just about the carriers' operations that will need to be adjusted along with the new networks, but it's also about the commercial side as well, because how these rival carriers are going to compete under the new market landscape is still to be seen. And surely I think we can expect some fireworks in the market, and we have already seen some early indications of how this is going to pan out, because there's been a very sharp increase in new ship orders that's been announced in the last 2 months alone. And from the individual company's perspective, I think there is an understandable intention for the carriers to want to build additional capacity in order to protect. And in a lot of cases, they also want to seek to grow their market share. And Maersk is an interesting example of this, especially now that the Shanghai deal is off for them. The question is, what's next for Maersk? Now, having lost their number 1 position in the market, and very soon they will also lose the number 2 position as well. And to me, Maersk really doesn't have any real options right now except to refocus on growing their liner market share again. And they do have an immediate problem on their hands right now, because they don't have sufficient ships to cover all of the holes in the new Gemini network. So I think there's certainly plenty of risk to think about there.
Indeed, a lot to think about, and no doubt the topic for another podcast to come. Short term, things may be calming down a bit after a early hot summer, and we could be in for a more chilled out autumn. But there are too many swing factors right now to rule out further volatility to come. So we will be back next week with more, and no doubt more volatility, and as ever, we will endeavour to keep you up to speed with the stories shaping shipping. For now, though, my thanks to Sani, Chantal and HJ for talking to me this week, and my thanks to you for taking the time to listen. Have a good week, stay safe out there, goodbye.